I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we are going to be finishing our 4-part series on Back to the Basics. This week we'll be talking about clarifying text, which is kind of an amalgamation of things that didn't fit in the other videos, but I think are very important for sentences, structure, all of the above. And so we're going to jump right into it. This one will be a little shorter than the rest of the ones because we're just kind of picking up the pieces of the last bits. First thing I want to talk about is the word it. Okay, I-T, it. The problem with it is sometimes the way that it's used in a sentence, it is not clear what it is. You need to go through your manuscript and make sure that it is clarified every single time. This isn't like adjectives and adverbs where we don't want them. It is a fine word as long as it's clear what the word actually means. What is the it that you are referring to? Do a universal search. It is kind of hard because any word that has IT in it will show up in a universal search, but it's really important to do because you need to make sure that it is clarified what it is, which is why I'm calling this clarifying text. Another thing that you need to be on the watch for are the cliches. We talked a little bit about metaphors in an earlier video, and we talked a little bit about how you gotta be careful about using cliche words that we use all the time. The problem with cliches and colloquialisms is that people are very familiar with them, and when you use something different, it feels fresh, it feels new, and it feels different. It feels like something has to do with your character. It feels like something that is original. And that's what you want. You don't want people to read your book and say, this sounds just like this other author I read the other day. We don't want that. We want to take our readers on a journey. So we want them to feel like they're getting an experience from us. The caveat, of course, is that there are some terms that are used that would make sense in context. If you're writing about your characters on the city council, then them saying, I second that motion, would make complete sense within the context of the story. If you had a story, a coming of age story about a teenager, and they're talking about other teens and they said, I'm going to avoid them like the plague. Well, one, that's a very cliched statement. We know what it means, obviously, but it's not very original and doesn't really make sense in the context of your teenage character, probably. Would they use that statement? They probably use a different statement. And so that's where you have to kind of play around with words and word choices and clarify what you mean and make sure that the reader knows for sure, but they also, as they're learning through your statements, they're learning more about your characters. Cliches also sometimes come across as lazy writing, and I don't think that writers are lazy, obviously, but I think that you are denying yourself an opportunity to do better and to be more original and have more thought-provoking text and to create almost poetry on the page. I do want to warn you about creating your own colloquialisms and your own words. Some authors recently have gotten in trouble for this, where they've created kind of these words or colloquialisms and people have felt like the words were prejudicial or racist. I don't think that was the intent of the author, but based on what they were writing, that's how people took it. So be very careful if you're going to create your own words and your own little colloquialisms and things like that. Make sure that it works within the context of your story and the characters that you've created. It's neither here nor there. I could probably make a whole video about controversies within the book industry, but for now, I just want to caution you. You can do it, whether you agree or not, but just be conscious in that decision and make sure it's something that if somebody was interviewing you about, you could totally back up. The next thing I want to talk about is juxtapositions. Juxtapositions are an arrangement of two or more ideas, characters, settings, or words that are side by side that can create a contrast or comparing or add suspense into a story. A really good example of a very common trope juxtaposition is having a love triangle, and you have, let's say, a boy character who has two girls that he's, somehow interested in, and they are very different. Hunger Games is a good example because you've got two characters that are very different from one another, and like to the point where you're like, why would this person ever be with this person? It doesn't even make sense because they're so opposite of one another. Those juxtapositions sometimes make the story more interesting. Sometimes it just makes you roll your eyes and you go, well, of course they never end up with that person. That person's so different from them that, like, what do they have in common? You know, that's where you have to be careful not to fall into some of those traps, you know, where you have a character that doesn't make any sense with the character that you've created. It also can create a much deeper level, almost like a metaphor. So, for example, let's say that a mom wants to have a very serious talk, that she's getting a divorce from her husband, but she doesn't really know how to tell her child. And so she thinks, in all of her wisdom, that she is going to take this kid to a roller derby because her kid likes roller derby. And so she'll tell her this horrible thing at the roller derby competition because then maybe your kid will be happy and that'll work out, right? So it creates this weird juxtaposition because we're going to have this very serious talk at a roller derby competition, which is such an odd place for that to happen. And then it almost creates a metaphor in there because now the characters are, you know, the roller derby's going on, people are crashing to one another, and this child feels like her world is crashing down around her. And that creates weight, it creates a metaphor, and the juxtaposition works. And that it surprises the reader too because it feels so different from what they would expect, right? And that's a way of playing with juxtaposition. You can also use it in poetry. Example that I read once, and I'm not sure what poem it's from, but they said the sunset shined like a purple bruise on the horizon. And I thought that was such great imagery and is not what you expect. You don't expect to have a horizon described as a purple bruise, which it worked in the context of the poem because it was also about violence. And so I thought that really stood out and made it original and interesting and surprising all at the same time. So juxtaposition is a great thing to play around with. And hopefully you're doing more than just love triangles. Weird love triangles that I don't like. The next thing I want to talk about is thinking versus feeling. And this is a very nuanced thing, and it has to do with psychology, really. So one of the things that I learned from a psychology course that I took, and then later through a course I took through work, which had to do with dynamics within the workplace, is that when somebody says to a person who is a thinker that they feel something, the thinker thinks that the feeler hasn't researched it and they haven't done their due diligence to make sure that the information is correct, that they just based everything off of some gut feeling. That's not necessarily true. The feeler could very well have really studied this information, but they just used the word feel, and that is off-putting maybe to that person who's a thinker, and vice versa. Same thing. The feeler says, I feel this way, or I feel like this is the best way to present this idea to our coworker. And then the thinker says, well, I don't think that's a good idea. It seems to the feeler like they're not thinking about their feelings or including them. And so there's a happy medium in there, but when you are presenting ideas, if you're writing a nonfiction book especially, and you use the word feel, perhaps considering the word think or believe, you gotta be careful not to, you want to have authority, so you don't want to sound wishy-washy. So be careful how you're using language and clarify whether this is a belief, is a feeling, or it's a thought that you have, an opinion even. Make sure that you clarify what those things are so that your reader knows, and this is especially important in nonfiction. I think it's also important in fiction, but in nonfiction, clarifying that will help your readers connect to you better. In fiction, you want to make sure that if your character says they feel something, make it clear that they're feeling something and what that means. And luckily, we can kind of be in characters' heads when we're doing that, so we can know what that means, and you can kind of clarify that way. Finally, don't forget the five senses. Make sure that they're all there. And they don't have to all be in the same paragraph. That's why I didn't talk about that in paragraphs. You don't have to have them constantly bombarded with thought, and you don't have to have them constantly bombarding you with smells and sounds and whatever. But make sure that you are including those in your text, and make sure that your reader knows what a place sounds like, what a food tastes like. Don't forget about those things. Make sure they're there. It helps when you're doing descriptions. It helps when you're using adjectives and adverbs. It helps to create a sense of place. You can watch a previous video that I gave about the five senses and making sure that they're in there. I just think it is so important, and I want to remind writers as they're writing and they're working on their sentences and they're working on their paragraphs and they're choosing words, that they also not forget about those five senses being in there, because it's very easy to forget about them. As I've said in previous videos, some of this will start to come more naturally as you write. As you learn and as you grow as a writer, you're going to stop using verbal tics. They're not going to be in there as often. You'll question cliche phrases and think to yourself, there's a better way of saying that. Like as you write it, you'll go, and erase, and there's a better way of saying that. You might at the beginning start with almost like a checklist of things that you need to look for. I know that the first couple books I wrote required almost like a checklist of things that I needed to look for. Okay, I'm looking for this, I'm looking for that. I once sat down with a draft of my book and a thesaurus, and not looking for verbose verbs, looking for good other verbs that I could use that were stronger than the verb I was using. And that taught me a lot. And so then the next time I wrote the next book, I didn't have to do that for that draft. I was more careful, and I slowed down a little in my writing so that I can include better verbs. It doesn't mean that you're going to have it down. You're not going to write a perfect first draft the first time. It doesn't even mean that necessarily all of your first drafts will be great or get better. You might still have trouble on that first draft because you're the kind of person who just likes to throw information out there and then you fix it later. And I'm that kind of a writer. I just kind of type it all out and then I'll go back and I'll fix all the problems later. But like I said, as I've written more, I've also started to, I know what things I do wrong or things that I have trouble with, like passive voice, and I'm looking out for them as I'm writing. So I've slowed down a little bit, but I feel like because I've slowed down, my writing's gotten better the first time around. It still needs a lot of work when it's done though. Don't be afraid to just write little short stories to help you with some of these concepts. Slow yourself down, sit down with a short story that you want to write, challenge yourself to make it 1 page or 2 pages, and then see what you can do. What you can do if you slow down and you're really thinking about word choice and things like that. If you want, write by hand and tell yourself, I'm not going to go back and fix this. So as I'm writing it, I have to be very intentional about how I write, because that's how a lot of the classical authors did. They wrote by hand, and so they were kind of forced to slow down and really be intentional when they write. And so that's one of my challenges to you, if you want to try that, is slow yourself down a little bit, really keep some of the things in mind. Do a global word search and see what you're overusing and what your verbal tics are. Find a beta reader who might be able to point some out to you as well. And don't be afraid to make it bad. It's okay if it's bad. This is the end of our 4-part series of Back to the Basics. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. We post new writing tips on almost every Friday. I've been Venus with Galaxy Inc. I hope your writing is out of this world.